Hello, friends. My name is Ahor Havrischchak. This is the traditional platform of Channel 24. Today is November 25th, live broadcast. I ask you to be active, comment, ask questions, like, subscribe to those who are not yet subscribed, and, of course, share our conversations. And it is with great pleasure that I congratulate our guest. This is the former secretary of the Polish Delegation to the NATO Parliament, Piotr Kulpa. Peter, hello. Good afternoon, glory to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Peter, I want to start by saying that since it became known that Donald Trump will be the next president, the Joe Biden administration has made many good decisions and steps regarding the military personnel of Ukraine and Ukraine as a whole. These are anti-personnel mines. These are sanctions against Gazprom Bank in order not to receive money from European countries for gas and naphtha, and, of course, this is allowed to hit with ATACMS missiles. Tell me, please, do you think this is the decision of Biden and the Democratic administration, or the joint decision that Trump and Biden agreed on at the meeting? And, accordingly, is there a risk that when Trump comes, all these decisions will be rejected? I have already said in many interviews that Trump did it with Biden's hands. And this has very serious consequences. Firstly, it is clear that during the meeting of the presidents, they agreed and President Trump simply assumed strategic responsibility for the foreign policy of the United States, but everything seems to be going under the curtain of Biden's decisions. This is important because it starts a bargaining position in a good cop and a bad cop. This means that all these decisions are at Biden's expense. Biden may introduce himself as an evil cop, and Trump gently walks in and starts the conversation with Russia from the position of a good cop. In fact, this is a coup. I believe that what Ukraine has now received is thanks to Trump, and the question here is to hide it. There were a lot of statements, by the way, by Trump's son, and we saw Musk's statements on the network. In general, this is precisely to build Trump's position as a soft on Russia president who will start by offering Russia options that it will reject, and then he will turn into horror from Russia's point of view.
Как мягкого по отношению к России президента, который начнет с того, что будет предлагать России. Варианты, которые Россия отбросит, и потом он будет превращаться я не знаю, в ужас с точки зрения России.
It's just going to be Reagan squared.
В квадрате, вот так.
Peter, I would also like to ask you, both Bill and Lindsey Graham are talking about this. He claims that Zelensky and Ukraine have something to offer Trump. Since he is a businessman, and then a politician, he names Ukrainian resources, including metals, uranium, and the fact that Ukraine is part of Europe, and this can be used to build communication with Trump and knock out better conditions for Ukraine in the event of negotiations with Russia.
На цьому можна будувати комунікацію з Трампом і вибивати найкращі умови для України в разі якихось перемовин з Росією.
How true is this? I believe that this is nothing. This is a trifle. This is a type of assessment. The most important thing that Ukraine can offer the United States is that, in fact, the Ukrainian soldier made America great again, showed that the Second Army is in Ukraine.
Показал, что вторая армия является второй армией в Украине, а не в мире, да?
We can say that Ukraine is the main asset. The main thing that contributes to the architecture of the American order in the world is the army, which, according to Trump's plan, will be used not only as a shield of Europe, but also as a substitute for part of the American forces in Europe. Due to the fact that there is a strong Ukrainian army, which will be financed by Europe, but supplied with American weapons, this army is a key factor.
Но снабжаться американским вооружением
What business will do here is important from what point of view. It's just that the most important guarantee that they will come with help, that they will protect, is investment. This, for example, was looked at in Poland when they joined NATO in order to attract a lot of American, especially American, investment. For large corporations to enter Poland directly, because this is a prerequisite that in case of problems there will be support from the United States. This is the main point. Of course, from the point of view of an ordinary American, to show that we are entering, helping a country that has huge potential, which is in trouble. Well, talented, creative, great people, educated resources. You can just correct the control system. Well, the main thing, once again the main thing, is the military forces of Ukraine. And look, when the genetic war is stopped, Ukrainian soldiers will become soldiers of Europe. They will receive salaries with the money that Europe will provide. And the Russians come back, kill their neighbors, and just what they see, what happens to the army, which is falling apart and just creating crime. We saw what happened after Afghanistan, after every war in Russia, when these people with a weakened psyche return home. Our heroes just stay here, and this is an important factor that a career in the armed forces of Ukraine is for a long time. It is good, prestigious. What I am saying is that this war should change history in the sense that instead of glory to Ukraine and glory to the heroes, we should say glory to the heroes, glory to Ukraine, because everything rests on the heroes. Thus, Ukraine does not keep up with these heroes who are at war. I would say that in this way we separate ourselves from Banderism. Thus, we consolidate the memory of the victory in this war. Thus, we show symbolically that a person, a hero, is more important than the system that stands behind him and sometimes fails. This is my comment. By the way, Peter, about the end of this war. There is a Republican, Senator Mike Rounds, who is a top Trump ally. He said, "As much as I would like to believe that we can negotiate with a tyrant, I suspect that we are lying to ourselves. Do you believe that this tyrant, if you offer him a part of a free Ukraine, he will stop? I would like to say that there is an easy way out, but there is none." In general, he said that there was nothing to agree with Russia, but emphasized that this was his position, and not that of Trump's entourage and himself. I would like to know, Mr. Peter, how different the proposals are, very different, from Trump's entourage. Does he take someone's opinion into account? Or does he decide for himself? Look, there are two options. The first is the classic option, the doctrine of American policy, which was based on separating Russia from China by all means in order to preserve Russia as a pocket empire of the Anglo-Saxons. It should be remembered that in the mentality of the British elites, in the mentality of the American elites, Russia is their pocket empire, with the help of which they coped with Napoleon, Wilhelm II, with the help of Russia, they coped with Hitler. It's just that when in 1941 the Soviet army was defeated and everything was close to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, suddenly, thanks to the support from America, yes, it was possible to create a weapon from the defeated Soviet Union, with the help of which Nazi Germany was defeated. And this scenario he reigned, I would say, in principle, until the full-scale invasion.
pełnomasztabnego wtargnięcia.
What has happened since then? First, there was disappointment with the real strength of the Russian army. I repeat, the Ukrainian soldier made America a great dream. That's what happened. Secondly, look, the sanctions that were imposed by Trump, and then supported by Biden, began to weaken China very much. Thus, the Chinese economy, which already reached 78 to 89% of the American economy, began to decline due to sanctions, and today it is at the level of 64%. This means that together with the Russian economy, this small economy is already at the level of $2 trillion, that these economies, they are smaller than China once was. In short, due to erroneous economic policies, Russia has lost economic and political weight in such a way that it no longer has a strategic impact on the essence of security-related issues. I want to emphasize these key points. Look, you can't negotiate with Putin, because he does not comply with any treaties that he himself signed. But this is not even the question. Even if he did, he cannot suspend the war, because the suspension of the war simply destroys the entire structure and system of power that is built in Russia, which preserves the support of the majority of the people to this gangster elite, which introduces transfers of funds to the provinces into the system, because the money that the provinces receive instead of corpses is real transfers, which can be considered as a channel for the economic distribution of funds within society. But there is one more important argument. From the point of view of Putin, this criminal gang, Trump has nothing attractive to offer them. Because from Putin's point of view, Stalin's daughter or granddaughter is bad, the same Brezhnev, the same Yeltsin's family. And on the other hand, he sees his grandson Kim Il-sung on the throne, and no one spat on his grandfather, on his father. That's what Putin wants and likes. Therefore, he is interested in turning into North Korea. In short, he will shoot back to the last in order to preserve the status of North Korea. It is convenient for him, and North Korea has shown that such a model can exist. I would write there on the fourth day of the war, it's just inevitable. We will see more time when China will impose sanctions against Russia. Here, more or less so, in short, this option is unrealistic. What the senator is talking about is the second option, which is the most realistic, I would say, will be on the table here, the most realistic option, in short, actions from the standpoint of peaceful economic means, which will be used to take away steam, energy, money, means against aggression. Putin will be forced to limit the war by 100%, but since he needs a war, as I said, the greatest probability is that he will turn to the Caucasus, and the war will continue there on a very limited scale due to a shortage of funds. You say that Trump has nothing to offer Putin, and The Guardian writes that Trump can make a deal with Putin if he promises less contact with China. Or break off some contacts with China. How true does it look? Well, this is unrealistic. The level of Russia's dependence on China today is simply incredible. If Trump wanted to compensate for this, it would be necessary to allocate trillions of dollars for this, weapons and so on. But in addition, why does Putin need it? Putin does not want to be Trump, does not want to be Biden, does not want to be those politicians who leave, and others come in their place. He wants to create a family of his Kims, right? He wants to be an Asian who wants to rule this country with the help of nuclear weapons. He does not need many people who will get a certain amount of oil, and thus will sell. North Korea is the most realistic option. Trump has nothing that would be attractive to Putin, and all that this refusal can expect. Look again at how dependent Russia is on China today. China was already aware in 1914 that Stalin had started the war on Hitler's side, but ended it on Roosevelt's efforts. Therefore, since 2014, and especially during the full-scale invasion, China has used every day to increase Russia's dependence on itself, to sell everything that is technological to them at a high price, to take resources cheaply, not to invest and simply treat them, to weaken them so that in the event of a turnaround, so that it also does not change anything. Russia's problem today is that it is weak. But on the other hand, it is also its strength, because weakness is a concern in America, because the collapse of Russia is the same processes that they opposed when the Soviet Union was collapsing. This is a question of taking away nuclear weapons. This is this whole process. But we must remember and see that since the Soviet Union collapsed and they could not do anything, although they were against this process, remember Bush's speech in Kyiv, the same thing now, they will simply agree with what they have, and here, I repeat, the key force that is emerging is the wall from Finland, the Baltic countries, Poland and Ukraine. The strength of countries that can only survive with a strong US presence in Europe. And this position is very different from the position that has been so far when the United States relied on Germany. And it got to the point that the Nord Streams were built, and Mrs. Merkel appealed to American presidents to withdraw their troops from Europe, because they interfere and spoil Putin's mood. That's what I see. And so everything is cool here, everything is good. I have no doubt that this is just unrealistic. Peter, if we talk about the Europeans, Lamont says the following: now there are some secret negotiations about the possible sending of troops to Ukraine, and she says that these negotiations have become relevant again after November 11th, after British Prime Minister Keir Starmer visited France, met and talked with Macron. Look, in Europe there are two options that compete with each other at the end of the war. The first option is the German-Chinese one, in order to quickly end the war even before Trump comes to power, force Putin to do it and thus prevent Trump from doing it on his own terms. This option, it seems to me, is less useful from the point of view of Ukraine, I would say, but it is clear that Putin does not agree. It seems to me that now the Chinese and all those who were in cooperation with the Germans are hunting for Putin. Therefore, he will now hide and shoot back with missiles. He will just behave like Kim Jong-un. He's in that position now. In fact, it is an element that gets in everyone's way. And I think that the procedures for preserving life are now key for him. This is one option, and it is being considered within the Weimar Triangle with France and Poland. Why does Scholz like this option, which is important for the German? Because if this option is implemented, then an agreement will be reached on support for Ukraine, and most importantly, this agreement will concern the support of Europe as a whole. In short, more or less the Greeks, Germans, Finns and French will pay proportionally the same. The second project is being done by the British, the Anglo-Saxons, and it must be remembered that any British Prime Minister will be much more heard in Washington than any German Chancellor or French President. This is the option of Central Europe, this is Poland, but also France has joined this option, and this is a reflection of Macron's big speech in Bratislava last year, where he pointed to Germany as responsible for the current situation, for a full-scale invasion, and simply offered the power of France to strengthen the sovereignty of Central Europe. In short, he proposed the creation of a small entente, which existed until 1939, in principle, until the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Protocol, when in that version Russia was excluded from the European security architecture, and European security was guaranteed to France, as well as Central Europe. This option is important for two reasons. First, it leaves the possibility of reaching a higher level if Trump comes to power, because in this option we understand that Trump looks at Europe as a small China and is going to also introduce tariffs, sanctions, duties on the exports of the European United States. But, thanks to this tool, it must be understood that the funds that will be collected from these tariffs will essentially be intended to strengthen the presence of the United States in Europe or, in other words, to finance the military forces of Ukraine. And by imposing these tariffs, Trump can very easily influence which country will pay how much. And it can punish those who led to a full-scale invasion, those who invited Putin to Europe, those who built the Nord Streams, those who took American soldiers out of Europe. It can very easily punish with tariffs, for example, on engineering, on cars, on cognac, on water, all this. This option, from the point of view of old Europe, is much more dangerous. Therefore, they want to negotiate with Putin and China now. More or less this is what it looks like, but that's not all. Here, beyond this point, the question concerns the identity situation of Europe as a whole continent, because in the position in which Europe finds itself today, it is a system without leadership. Trump does not recognize Ursula von der Leyen as the representative of Europe. If you look at the situation in Germany, Scholz's choice is a wounded duck. Macron is very much weakened by the results of the elections in the European Parliament, and then by the internal elections, so without the support of Parliament, his position will be significantly weakened. And it turns out that Europeans are forced to negotiate among themselves and seek agreements so that Europe does not become a victim and is not used in the way that China or the United States did. Because Europe's level of dependence on the United States is much less than on China. If you look, for example, this means that Europe is forced not only to find agreement and start talking about its place in the modern world, but also to abandon crazy ideologies that greatly limited the development potential of European countries. This is green energy. These are very high social standards, all sorts of different ones. This is a question of the very idea of the existence of the European Union. The only thing that really unites the European Union is the establishment of standards for access to the European market, as well as the requirement for those who want to supply goods to it to comply with these standards. We can agree that standards can be set in this industry. For example, France set the standard for sewing when French fashion was at its best. For example, Lloyd's set the standard for ship insurance when Britain had the most powerful navy. The United States set the standard for gold when it controlled the world's economy. Europe is not backward, and Europe is very much losing its potential in the world. Only 20 to 30 years ago, Europe was an equal economic system in relation to the United States. Today, it's 60%, and all projections are down, given the incredible growth in the United States, as the process of reindustrialization progresses at a rate of 150, 170, 300% per year, year after year, if you look at the regions. The United States, which is the most attractive system for investment today, the dollar from all over the world is returning to the United States. Everything we see indicates that Trump's proposal for liberalization, withdrawal, de-ideologization of policies, including Trump's supervision of green energy, etc., is a manifestation of ideology. It turns out that a serious conversation should begin in Europe and important things should be put in the first place. Well, it cannot be that security, which should be in the first place for every person, for every normal, thinking people, is in the last place in Europe, and in the first places are issues that are simply third-rate. It seems that this conversation is needed in every country, as well as at the level of Brussels. Mr. Peter, one last question. We have been talking for half an hour about the options that may be in Russia's war against Ukraine. I would like to ask you, what next? Who can guarantee with whom it is possible to agree that the day after the agreement with Putin he will not violate this agreement? Well, look, first of all, if there is a treaty, there will be a separation zone, where the issues of European soldiers or European and American soldiers will be introduced. Because there is also a conversation in Europe about the presence of even insignificant American forces. Firstly. Secondly, there is the army of Ukraine, which will be a real force, which will not be disbanded, which will be financed by European countries. Here we must remember that we hear the demand not for 2, but for 3%, which is necessary to maintain security. I want to remind you that Poland allocates 4.7%, so there will be 100% funds for this. Further, this is the second guarantee. Third guarantee, we are just very little aware of it, but I am very, very well aware of it. And I want to say that Ukraine is very much increasing its own technological security potential every day. I want to say about long-range drones and ballistic missiles that supply Ukraine with force. In fact, today, please, I just want to be believed. I say this quite seriously. I am just very afraid for how quickly and how badly Russia can be defeated by Ukraine. I just have no doubt about it, and this is the third factor. In fact, it will not be the case that someone will guarantee Ukraine's security. On the contrary, NATO will turn into a passive organization that will raise funds so that the countries participating in this system receive security, so that it is not a free security system, as it has been until now, so that it will simply be a system for collecting taxes from allies for security related to the availability of logistics, security that the United States provides.
За безопасность, связанную с доступностью логистики, которую эта безопасность Соединенные Штаты предоставляют.
And the Ukrainian army will be exactly this guarantor. And in fact, since Putin was afraid that NATO would guarantee something in Ukraine, it turns out, it seems to me, the opposite. And that's what we're hearing from Trump's camp. More or less so. Peter, I am very grateful to you for this conversation. I am grateful that you took half an hour to explain about this important process that is now taking place. I would very much like the way you explained it to happen. Thank you. I want to add one more thing, that we are in a transition period of 2 months. There is a lot of hostile information, which no one needs Ukraine. America does not care about Ukraine, Central Europe and so on, without pretense, which are internal provocations, showing that everything is falling apart. There are Russians advancing. All this is nonsense. People, don't believe it. We are in anticipation of the victory that will come soon. Thank you. Let me remind our viewers that Piotr Kulpa.
Glory to Ukraine, to the defense forces. I'm Fakhruddin Sharafmal, and I'm speaking with legal analyst Andriy Vihirinsky to discuss key topics. Andriy, it's good to see you. We will talk about old and new topics. To begin with, Erdogan hosted Secretary General Mark Rutte, and they discussed the confrontations taking place in the world in general, wars, the Middle East, and they talked about Ukraine and ending the war. The focus, as I understand it, is on Erdogan's peace plan, which is about at least 10 years of rejection of NATO, a ceasefire, supplying Ukraine with weapons as compensation, and so on. If the NATO Secretary General went there, then theoretically the North Atlantic Alliance is preparing for the fact that this is the plan. But this scenario, because it is similar to what the Trump team is proposing and what Erdogan is proposing, and theoretically, this scenario could form the basis for ending the war. Theoretically, yes. The only question is that there is a need to find the same position. This should be voiced by a notional group of globalists, including Ursula von der Leyen in France, and the Baltic states should join in. In this context, the EU's institutional branch should signal the situation in this format.
системи органів державного управління чи міждержавного управління в Європейському Союзі, треба, щоб вони подали сигнал чи озвучили ситуацію, пов'язану з таким форматом регулювання.
Although from the point of view of the Security Alliance, from the point of view of the North Atlantic Alliance, neither Ursula's nor the European Commission's consent is required. But it is probably necessary to follow the dynamics of the fact that over the weekend, there was information that Mr. Rutte met with Donald Trump. Not officially. There were no official positions on this matter, let's say, in terms of conflicts, that were expressed in the North Atlantic Alliance at the summit in Washington, which need to be resolved, because the Trump era, as we know, according to him, is an era without war. So, let's say the conflicts that were mentioned in the communiqué this year, they must be completed, because one way or another, the United States is a key security partner in the North Atlantic Alliance, and this is a story that concerns the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The issue of the confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah concerns Turkey in particular, as Erdogan sharply criticizes Israel and its actions against the civilian population in Gaza.
Ердоган доволі жорстко висловлювався по відношенню до Ізраїлю і по відношенню до тих злочинів, які вчиняли по відношенню до цивільного населення на території сектору Газа.
And we see that in general, the media are doing that. I think Reuters wrote just yesterday that both Lebanon and Israel have confirmed that the agreement is such that there are no contradictions to not approve it in the future. They have also agreed on the period of troop formation on the border. Within 2 months, within 60 days, Hezbollah units should be withdrawn, regular state troops should be deployed on the border. They have agreed on the issue, in principle, that relate to the same period of elections and so on. And even the global markets, in this case we are talking about gold and oil, they react positively to these signals, in a way that they offset the risk premium in the price that arose during the beginning of these crises, which means that gold prices are falling, oil prices are also falling. So in general, the commercial market looks positively at this information. And this information is in the interests of the United States and most likely Erdogan as well, as he presents himself as a defender of the Islamic, let's say, or the Arab world, against, let's say, Israel's position. From the point of view of Ukraine, now the question is not about the timing, that is, whether it is a 20-year freeze on joining NATO or a 10-year freeze, but the fact that the issue of integration into NATO is being crystallized. It will be part of the agreement, it will be, and it will contain a provision that for some time, we will not consider joining, or the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance will not consider enlargement. This is basically a kind of intermediate option between the categorical positions that existed during the Biden era, which were voiced and called by Mr. Blinken and Jacob Sullivan, that the door to NATO is open, and when the moment comes when you're ready and everything is in place, you will definitely become, that is, NATO without Ukraine is unthinkable, and so on. It is indeed unthinkable, but it will most likely be unthinkable even after 10 or 15 years have passed. Why I say that this is a compromise position, because on the other hand, there is the position of Russia, which says that there is no NATO at all and just a fixed neutral status. That is, on the one hand, no, on the other hand, yes. But someday and somewhere in between, look, no. But for a certain period of time, and maybe someday it will be so. That is a kind of mediocre story. It is being voiced by Jade Vance. It is gradually being voiced and will be voiced by Waltz. It is a form of probing, including the Russian position, whether it is amenable to change, adjustment, and so on or not. And in this vein, it is difficult to say what the Russian Federation will be ready to do in the course of the negotiations, whether it will insist on it. That the status should still be and remain neutral, and whether it is in principle a good option in general.
принципі, її такий варіант в цілому влаштує.
After the meeting with Trump, the visit to Erdogan is a negotiation platform.
Це все-таки переговорний майданчик. Це раз.
Erdogan had already hosted the negotiations and was a communicator. We are talking about the Istanbul Communique.
Нагадаю, до Стамбульського комюніке постійно відсилає офіційний Кремль.
The Kremlin constantly refers to the Istanbul Communique, considering it the only place where the parties reached basic agreements to resolve the war. The main points of the communique include neutral status and guarantor countries.
До того, що до них можна, не те, що можна, їх базис є, від них треба відштовхуватись уже з урахуванням там реалій на землі. Серед пунктів Стамбульського комюніке дійсно було питання, які стосувалися нейтрального статусу і країн-гарантів.
That is, at that time, Ukraine and Russia were ready for a multilateral agreement related to providing security guarantees for Ukraine, firm guarantees against possible illegal invasion, and these guarantees were spelled out better than in Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty establishing the North Atlantic Alliance. Therefore, given what Mr. Wald says about that we need not only to bring the other side to the negotiating table, but also to understand the role and importance of our European partners, given that the Ukrainian side says that we will not sit face-to-face at the negotiating table with Russia. We also come to the second point, that the actual end of hostilities, or an agreement on the end of hostilities, in addition to the point that concerns the NATO issue, can also concern the NATO issue. It will be multilateral, and among these multilateral actors should be the nuclear countries of Europe, France, and the United Kingdom, of course, and the United States, the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation will most likely insist that India and, let's say, China should be among the guarantor countries for balance.
Скоріш за все просити про те, не просити, а настоювати на тому, що серед країн-гарантів повинні бути Індія і, допустимо, Китай.
They will talk about Belarus, which was a controversial issue even in Istanbul. This is the second point that is understandable in terms of how the negotiating positions will develop. At the same time, we need to talk about this, or can we talk about it? Because in 2024, a book was published in the Russian Federation, written by Karaganov and Trenin, about strategy, and they use the word nuclear deterrence, not nuclear deterrence, but a shift to a nuclear deterrence strategy. I haven't translated it yet. Deterrence, intimidation, nuclear intimidation, but it seems like it's possible. Yes, it's possible, it's possible. And in this case, the way they describe a potential change in Russia's foreign policy in the security sector, including in relations with the North Atlantic Alliance and the United States, it's very similar to our domestic political rhetoric. You know, when we start talking about nuclear weapons and say, Russia will not strike. Why? It cannot strike because it will be against a country in the global south. They take this rhetoric and turn it completely around. The U.S. nuclear umbrella is a myth. And this myth has been confirmed historically. The fifth article is a fiction, and they will not protect the partner countries if they are threatened. Therefore, in principle, within the framework of this strategy of nuclear intimidation, we can and should ensure geopolitical stability and geopolitical deterrence. And geopolitical deterrence is about achieving the goals that we set for ourselves and the goals that they set for themselves. Well, I'm, let's say, unifying the whole text. I don't remember 150 or 160 pages of the book. It's quite a quick read. But this, well, the specificity of the worldview reflects, because many things that have already happened to us in the last week, they are also reflected there, but they are reflected in terms of potential or plans, what this nuclear intimidation might actually look like. And in this vein, they are saying that they see it as possible and right for the United States to withdraw from the conflict in Ukraine, saving face.
те, щоб Сполучені Штати вийшли з конфлікту в Україні, зберігши обличчя, але в принципових для нас...
But in principle, in matters of principle for us, a peace-loving borderland, we must not retreat, lest we demonstrate, say, the loss of our civilizational component that forms our image. Therefore, unfortunately, all these issues that we are discussing now are somewhere in there in terms of painfulness.
Тому, на жаль, ці всі питання, які ми зараз обговорюємо, вони з точки зору болючості знаходяться десь там в кінці.
In these important issues. Because the most painful issue for us will be an attempt to find a compromise on the legal consolidation or legal form of how a certain ceasefire agreement, if it contains this clause, will reflect the fate of the territory that the Russian Federation illegally annexed to its territory from the point of view of international law.
Тих, які Російська Федерація прийняла для себе рішення про незаконне рішення з точки зору міжнародного права.
This will be a painful decision, and they will emphasize the need to recognize the territory based on the assumption, which they consider credible, that there is no actual possibility of returning these territories to Ukrainian control.
Фактичної можливості повернути під контроль ці території в Україні немає.
For us, in this part, any wording that does not force us and does not impose conditions on us related to amending the Constitution may be a compromise. So, in principle, the story of what is being discussed on various platforms is to resolve the issue later through referendums, to resolve the issue later after the territories are cleared, to put it outside the brackets for a negotiation process for 10 to 15 years. This is also a positive result for us today, given that we do not have the resources and means for physical return, and they are not provided. Russia sees this touch as important for itself, among other things, because it has spent a long time and considerable effort to ensure that the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance do not achieve their goal of Russia's strategic defeat. The task of Russia's strategic defeat. Therefore, the situation is complicated, and it is not only in the plane of what Trump will offer and whether we will agree to it. The situation is that the Russian side will not be negotiating from a position of weakness. It will not negotiate from a position of readiness to simply agree. To make this format of dialogue possible, the United States and the North Atlantic Alliance need to be involved, and that's what Mark Rutte is here for. Change their position on military infrastructure on the territory of the countries that joined the alliance after 1997. No one will take away military bases, but, for example, missile defense systems or medium and short-range missiles will be considered by Russia as something that will need to be moved somewhere. This relocation can be formalized through a secret protocol to the treaty. An international treaty does not always contain only a public part. There is always the possibility that there are parts of the treaty that are not subject to public disclosure. If we don't go back to the historical Molotov-Ribbentrop pacts, the secret part of the agreement remained unknown to people who lived in the 60s and 70s, just as the secret part of the agreement between North Korea and Russia remains unknown, although it is said to exist and includes a military component. Therefore, there will be a public part of the negotiations, there will be a non-public part, and the general framework of NATO-Russia relations will be important. This is exactly why Mark Rutte travels the world. Last week he met with Romanians, and in addition to the elections, Romania is building the largest NATO military base in Eastern Europe, with 2,800 hectares of land and investments of up to $3 billion. These are not only training centers, but also facilities for missile defense systems.
І в тому числі об'єкти поясу, скажімо, систем протиракетної оборони.
because this wide range of issues is being addressed, on the one hand, invisibly for us, because we narrow everything down to the fact that we met and talked about Ukraine. In fact, it seems to me that they are already working on what framework of agreements on NATO-Russia relations to negotiate, and they are doing so even using NATO institutions. That is, the Trump administration has a common vision, consultations are also taking place, both internally between allies, and the possibility of negotiations with the Russian Federation cannot be ruled out, of course, because it is a party to this war. However, the question is that these processes are accelerating, and they want to achieve, as with Israel, a state of cessation of hostilities. If not in the first months, then at least in the longer term, because they don't want to get bogged down in a quagmire of conflicts. Because if you get involved, roughly speaking, if you approve the budget for the next year, you will have to supply something all year long, even if you can choose the nomenclature. But if the hostilities continue with the same dynamics, if they do not change, you will still be forced to move through these rounds of escalation. Waltz just said over the weekend that these rounds of escalation need to be stopped so that they don't move further, because there is a high risk that at some stage of escalation, we will move to thermonuclear war, and no one wants that. And this is where a bit of a philosophical question may arise. Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, suggested that if Ukraine had started moving towards NATO in 2008, the country would have been able to get to the hot. Russia could have started a war against us earlier. She said this in an interview with the BBC. But if you think about it, maybe in a philosophical way, was NATO alone the reason for Russia's attack on us? Escalation, the desire for annexation, existed before, including in Crimea in the 1990s, and the work on Donbass did not begin in 2014. So it's strange to hear such information. I understand that there were Russian bases in Crimea, and it's not a good idea to just say, let's all join NATO without taking Russia's opinion into account. But as you said, these are all issues for discussion. We can move, we can negotiate, we can discuss. That's why this comment seemed a bit manipulative to me. She often defends herself, and I think this was her defense against the criticism of her policy towards Ukraine. As you know, it is traditional for Ukrainian politics to criticize politicians after they resign. But Germany accepts our experience. Not even Germany. I wouldn't say that Germans are critical of Angela Merkel's position. That is, there is no criticism within German society, because what is there to criticize?
Навіть не Німеччина, я б не сказав, що німці критично до позиції Ангели Меркель відносяться. Тобто всередині німецького суспільства там немає критики. А за що критикувати?
She actually provided cheap energy resources to the industrial base that formed the most powerful export-oriented economy in the European Union. So excuse me, from the point of view of her own social existence, she was not just a chancellor for 20 years or so. This is an incredible period. If she was in office in 2008 and only left office in the 2020s, it's really 17 years or whatever. This is an absurd term, because no one questioned the democratic nature of the chancellor in a parliamentary republic. Again, the interpretation of history is a thankless task, because it requires the study of different positions. And in the vein that Merkel is talking about, she notes that we can use as an example the story that the war in Ukraine did not start in 2008 in Georgia as a reaction. That is, on the one hand, it was part of the strategy of the United States, which was implemented at that time by George W. Bush. He believed that the moment of Russia's weakness continues, and accordingly, everything that concerns the eastward movement, everything that will concern the eastward movement of NATO institutions has the right to life. After all, the agreements or commitments that the Russian side often talks about are actually related to the actual commitments that they have made. The text of the NATO-Russia Founding Act agreement states that the countries do not, as a matter of principle, expand, including by increasing the conventional component of armaments or expanding blocs to the detriment of the interests of the other signatory. And Russia interprets this principle of the indivisibility of security as one that should take into account its position or its interests. Russia realizes, and it also writes about this directly in historical excursions, that NATO's eastward advance was a consequence of the weakness of the Russian Federation in the economic, political, and financial sense. They lost not only the Cold War, but they also lost because of the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and they lost the ability to influence their own contour, the one that is vital to them.
Той, який для них є життєво важливим по відношенню до країн, з якими вони знаходяться по сусідству.
The year 2008 actually closed this window of opportunity because oil prices were at a fairly high level. Putin had already been in power for some time, not his first term. And yet, George W. Bush arrived at the NATO summit and said that we should accept. At this point, the French and Germans, who had direct trade and economic relations with Russia, were on board. Said their word, because they understood that in the event of war, they would assume the risks of direct combat. After all, in terms of a military threat to the United States, there is no such threat. No country today will sail across the ocean and storm the United States. Missiles are a system that can be countered if we are talking about, for example, conventional missiles, air defense systems, and that's about it. There is critical infrastructure where there are cyber threats or terrorist attacks, but no storming, seizure, or blockade. As Trump said, there is no threat from Mexico except for illegal migrants, just like with Canada. For the United States, it was an expansion of spheres of interest, and for Europe, it was a risk of war. So Europeans... including the French and Germans, said no. Putin personally attended that NATO summit and spoke to the leaders of the North Atlantic Alliance himself. The United States had the opportunity to ignore Russia's interest at that time. Europeans took this position based on the experience of the Second World War and the Cold War.
Все те, що стосується і Другої світової війни, і Холодної війни, і розуміючи, з ким вони як зіткнуться у випадку, якщо
who they would face and how they would face it if they had to engage in combat, because it would be their risk, not the United States. Then there were the events concerning Abkhazia and Georgia, and although the scale of the war was different, the Russian Federation's troops remained there.
Російської Федерації. І можна на цю подію дивитися як на сигнал до того, що ваші ідеї і плани пов'язані з...
This event can be interpreted as a signal that your plans to include Georgia and Ukraine in NATO are a point of no return for us, and we will fight for it militarily. However, we do not view the situation in this way. And then it turns out that Merkel was not lying, because these events have turned into a certain confrontation with a military component. This happened in 2014, not just then. Moreover, in this interval, namely until 2022, there was still Syria, which also demonstrated that Russia has accumulated enough financial and military resources to participate in military operations and support certain governments. And by supporting these governments, Russia will protect its sphere of interests. This is one way of interpreting the situation, and it allows us to understand why we did not become a NATO member from 2008 to 2022 and even 2025. When NATO was expanding to include Poland, Romania, Hungary, and other countries, we were not ready for it. And this period coincided with the time when Russia was absorbing everything that was accepted in the West because it was economically dependent on loans and politically unstable. We didn't have time then because each stage requires a certain historical context for decision-making. And now, when NATO countries talk about a possible moment when Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, it looks more like a forecast for the future, in case Russia self-destructs. However, this does not mean that Russia will disintegrate into 30 independent republics, but there will be a period of turbulence, weakness, social unrest, and probably no time to resolve issues with Ukraine.
А раз їм буде не до вас, то в цей момент ми вас, власне кажучи, і приймемо. А потім вони просто приймуть це як факт. Ми просто не знаємо, коли це відбудеться. 50, 70, 90 років, 100, онуки побачать, не онуки. Але вони ж не обманюють. Тоді, коли
So when this moment comes, we are ready to be accepted. Although it is impossible to say exactly when this will happen. It could be in 50, 70, or even 100 years. Our grandchildren will see it, or they won't. However, these countries now realize that this time will not come, at least not in the next 10 to 15 years. And this is also fair, because the period of Russia's weakness, when there is an alliance with China, is still a very distant prospect. And China is not currently in a state of decline. And although there may be a decline of China or even a collapse of the Communist Party someday, analogies with empires teach that even the United States, as an empire, can also collapse. The future of states as a whole is uncertain. Therefore, if one empire or a country with imperial ambitions collapses, it does not mean that another cannot experience the same. And there are certain principles in this. When you do not have enough resources to support your ideological agenda and geopolitical power, because this requires financial resources, economy, trade, and influence on world organizations, you may not be able to remain a great country either. That is why Merkel's words can be interpreted as a confirmation of the real processes that are already taking place in other areas, as well as a justification of her own position. At the same time, these words resonate with our situation, because it is NATO, not just NATO.
Її ж слова лягають і на нашу сьогоднішню ситуацію.
But also NATO itself, Russia used to justify its invasion of Ukraine. And it turns out that, in fact, the issue of Ukraine was fundamental and important for Russia in 2008, 2000, 2014, and 2022, and they were ready to use force. And
І вони були готові застосовувати силу і зброю по відношенню до можливого розширення блоку на схід.
They were ready to use force to expand the bloc to the east, considering this area to be critically important. Therefore, membership in NATO is not our choice, but a matter of consensus within the alliance. The reaction to Ukraine's accession to NATO depends on Russia's policy of protecting its interests, despite the contradiction of this with the principles of the United Nations. However, in this case, the Russian Federation refers directly to the UN Charter, claiming self-defense. Why? Because the enemy bloc is approaching our borders, violating the principle of indivisibility of security enshrined in the Helsinki Accords, and posing a threat. We are defending ourselves. The question is not about the interpretation of international law, but about all countries having the same understanding of it. For some period of time after the Helsinki Accords, everybody interpreted it the same way. Until 1991, the United States, Russia, and the Soviet Union all interpreted what was written there the same way. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States interpreted it in its own way, and Russia could not do it in its own way, and now Russia thinks it can. So when we talk about some absolute, the absolute of universal objectivism, which is called a norm of international law, it may exist depending on how you read it. And the second important question is whether you want to fulfill it. The International Criminal Court will not allow you to lie. By the way, this is a good comparison. It was an honest, objective position. And to conclude our conversation, here's a publication from Le Monde, journalists. Who wrote that after Donald Trump came to power in Europe, talks about sending Western troops to Ukraine resumed.
Так от, публікація від Le Monde, які написали про те, що з приходом Дональда Трампа до влади в Європі відновилися розмови про відправлення західних військ на територію України.
It is hard to imagine regular troops on the territory of our country now.
Але все, що стосується умовних приватних військових кампаній.
But as far as notional private military campaigns, companies that will service equipment, troops, such as the French Foreign Legion, it is really only in France among European countries. But we can't discount the facts of private military companies, instructors, and so on. We can't rule it out. And why not? They will learn from the experience, make some contribution, a contribution, without political consequences for their countries. I took this publication a little differently.
Там трошки публікація, я її по-іншому читав. Тобто є от оце нашарування, не по-іншому в сенсі, інший текст, і інтерпретував її по-іншому. Є от це нашарування, яке стосується інструкторів, там, приватних...
There are layers here as far as instructors from private military companies are concerned, and so on.
Фактично, роль цих військ
And there is another separate comment that the role of these troops will actually be to be a kind of hedgehogs that will deter a potential offensive or ensure a ceasefire. That is, for us, the starting point in this publication is as follows. Look, the instructors will teach. We can. But without engaging in combat, we will learn from the experience, and so on.
А потім іде те, що вони, грубо кажучи, по суті хотіли туди вкласти. Що Франція і Британія,
France and Britain, as nuclear powers, could play a key role in securing a ceasefire, especially given Germany's political weakness. This shows that Starmer and Macron are discussing Europe's role in resolving the conflict in Ukraine, independent of US-Russian negotiations.
Тоді цей матеріал дійсно має певний ефект новизни, продемонструє, що Стармер і Макрон в цілому обговорюють якісь практичні речі.
They will be at the table, realizing that they will have to do all the heavy lifting. The United States will not be involved in negotiations, the creation of humanitarian corridors, the movement of goods and people, economic issues, or sending aid. All of this should be regulated locally.
Неприємна рутина, пов'язана з врегулюванням. Коли я говорю неприємна рутина, та в якій, трясовина, в якій можна погрузнути, чим точно Америка займатися не буде. Це переговори, зустрічі, комунікації.
And they understand that there will be no American troops on the territory of Ukraine in any form, and they will have to participate in this process. As for consultants, training, and so on, this is already part of the history that exists today. For example, Caesar howitzers come and maintain them, instructors come and teach them.
На території України ні в якому вигляді. А доведеться їм приймати участь в цьому. Все те, що стосується там консультантів, навчання і так далі, і тому подібне.
That is, it is already a military contingent, which can be in the form of a private military company.
Приїжджають, обслуговують гаубиці «Цезарь»,
What is the problem with a private military company if it has trained soldiers who can protect a site in Sumy region, for example, for a financial reward? An official contract is to protect a settlement. Now, a private military company comes in and provides active defense services.
Офіційний контракт захистіть населений пункт такий-то на території Сумщини. От прийшла приватна військова компанія, здійснює оборонні послуги.
But the main difficulty for a private military company in this process is, as in the case of Wagner, who will provide the equipment, heavy armor, artillery, aviation, who will supply it.
Така ж історія, як з Вагнер. А хто буде техніку важку, бронетехніку, гаубиці, авіацію, хто буде постачати?
Private military companies cannot have F-16s or F-35s or Rafale or any other aircraft, because only the relevant armed forces in the country have the right to have it, not companies. That is why I look at this publication and see it from the point of view that Europe understands its role in the settlement, which will not be to simply join the position of the United States, but to play a more active and responsible role, in particular, for them, the presence of military forces as a force of separation between the parties on the battlefield. They are preparing for this, and note in the publication that the Scandinavians, as well as troops or units from Poland, may be sent. Why? In fact, because Scandinavia and Poland are the most capable armed forces on the European continent, along with Turkey, not French or British troops. There are very few British troops at all, and of those that matter, it is mainly the Navy and Air Force, not the ground forces. Britain does not have a large ground army, but as a nuclear power, its status remains high in terms of possible security guarantees. Plus, Britain is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, as is France. Therefore, there is no point in instructors from them at all, because in fact, we already have better instructors than those from NATO countries who have not participated in wars of this nature. Our instructors who train our soldiers talk about this in particular because they have visited training centers both here and there, and these are completely different approaches to the army, with different states of readiness. They can teach how to use equipment, I agree, but there is no need to send a contingent for this. Roughly speaking, at best, we need repair teams with the appropriate equipment. But this is no longer a question of a brigade that can provide evacuation, but rather an enterprise that should have a certain line for major repairs, at least replacement of barrels if necessary, so as not to transport Caesar to France.
Для цього тут ми вже говоримо скоріше не стільки про бригаду. Бригада може забезпечити евакуацію, скільки про підприємство, яке повинно мати певну якусь лінію, принаймні, крупновузлового ремонту там чи заміни стволів, якщо це відбувається, щоб не буксирувати Цезарь у Франції.
For repairs after it's shot off.
Поміняти після того, як він відстрілявся.
These are technical things that matter, but you don't need private military companies for this. You need a little bit of a different interaction, but in the context that I think was mentioned about the demarcation, it demonstrates, it complements the 2 points that we talked about at the beginning. In fact, including the sending of troops, whether it will be private military companies or foreign armies, I'm just wondering how it will look and what it could lead to. Because if we were conditionally afraid of war from the point of view of Europeans, but we sent troops, then in their opinion, this is not an escalation, not even once. Russia has not said anything to us about such an escalation. Literally, Russia is talking about something every day.
Буквально Росія говорить кожен день про якихось там найомників, коротше, і так далі.
From my point of view, this is not a factor of fear, but a factor of perception of the policy that the Kremlin is currently implementing. If indeed some regular troops from France or Britain arrive and they are deployed, Russia, knowing that they are French or British, will strike.
З Франції чи з Британії. Вони не несуть удар по цим військам. Ну, якщо вони будуть дислоковані, згуртовані десь в якомусь місці, вони свідомо...
Because gradually they begin to believe, or at least allow in their minds, that there will be no reaction to this.
Вони починають вірити, чи допускати в голові думку про те, що,
This does not mean that they want to attack France or Britain, no, but they, like us, assume that they will or will not strike, are afraid or not afraid, and so on. They assume that there will be no nuclear response. In the ground component, no one will send regular troops here to participate in the war.
А в сухопутній компоненті ніхто війська сюди не буде вводити регулярні для участі у війні. Власне кажучи, французи від...
That is why the French abandoned this idea in the spring, assessing the risk. They thought about whether they would strike or not, what it could lead to, and somehow distanced themselves from this story, citing domestic political problems. How skillful they are at the French evasion maneuver. Yes, it's good. Well, God bless you and long years of prosperity in the 5th or 6th French Republic. Andriy, thank you for the conversation, and thank you to our viewers for watching this far. We won't be saying goodbye for long, but we'll see you tomorrow at 10:15 on the stream. See you all tomorrow.
Довгих років процвітання, які там 5-й чи 6-й Французькій Республіці.
Андрій, тобі дякую за розмову. Нашим глядачам дякуємо, що додивилися до цього моменту. Надовго з вами не прощаємося, бо завтра о 10:15 на стрімі ми побачимося знову. До зустрічі.
До зустрічі.